inviting you to engage in what I think will be the most challenging and hopefully also the most exciting intellectual adventure of your career, as of now. And that's because we're going to be focusing on the truly great works of philosophy, Hegel's Science of Logic, a work of genuinely revolutionary character. That, however, has, since its appearance, been either gravely misinterpreted by most readers or completely ignored. It is a work that needs no introduction, to a degree unmatched by any other. Yet Hegel presents at least 4 different sorts of introduction to try to show why that is the case. And today I'd like to do something in my own right to try to prepare you for this radically different philosophical project which Hegel pioneers. Now, before I get into that, I just wanted to go over the mechanics of the course in case I exhaust all of our time. Do all of you have the syllabus? Okay. Now, there are 2 texts by Hegel that we'll be looking at in conjunction with one another. One's the Science of Logic, which is the principal text of the course, which, alas, is both extremely long and extremely dense. And it really is not feasible to read it or expect you to read it in any meaningful way in its entirety in one term. On the other hand, I do want to cover the book in its entirety in some respect. And to do so, I'm not only going to push you to do a fair amount of reading in the Science of Logic, but to also read selections from a work called Hegel's Logic, which is actually you could say Hegel's own first notes to his lectures. It's part of a work called the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, which was meant as, in a sense, chap notes for students who attended Hegel's lectures on different parts of his philosophical system. So at times we're going to rely upon the very abbreviated encapsulations of the argument to be found in the Logic, also sometimes known as the Lesser Logic, to make our way through portions that we would not have time to read in depth. I'm also going to be asking you continually to be looking at writings by people, mainly contemporaries, who are trying to think through the nature of the argument. And these books are listed under the required versions on reserve. They all are on reserve. If you feel like purchasing any of them, that's up to you. I think it would be wise to purchase a copy of the Science of Logic and the Logic. They're both in paperback, because I think it's a book you want to have a copy of your own to read and mark up, and reread and mark up. But the others, I'll leave it to you to decide how big a hole in your pocket you want to make. But they're available on reserve, and I encourage you to somehow figure out a way of laying hold of the text, even if the books themselves are going to be on 2-hour reserve. Some of them, however, are on electronic copy, and you can go to the library website, Guild, and look under courses, course readings, go to our course using either my name or the number of the course, and type in the secret password, which is Hegel. That will give you access to the text. Okay. And what I'd like you to somehow do by next Tuesday is to read one of the introductory discussions in the Science of Logic, page is 43 through 64. And I'd also like you to read a chapter from a book of mine called From Concept to Objectivity, which discusses both that the argument in that introduction, as well as in the other kind of introduction Hegel will provide us with in the opening pages in the Science of Logic, which we'll be reading on Thursday, a section entitled "With What Must Science Begin?" This chapter from Concept Objectivity discusses the relationship between these two discussions, that which appears in the so-called general notion of logic, which I want you to read by Tuesday, and that which occurs in the section entitled "With What Must Science Begin?" I'd also like you to look not briefly, but to look at a very brief set of theses by Karl Rapp in his book, Fleeing the Universal. Karl Rapp, by the way, recently retired from teaching English at the University of Georgia, but is someone who thinks and writes philosophically. And I think you'll find this thesis of his very interesting in presenting a critical look at many of the most prevalent trends in contemporary thought. And so presenting a critique of them, and in many respects is very similar to the kind of critique that Hegel will be presenting you with in the opening sections of his work. Okay, so those are the readings for the first week. Try to stay abreast of the readings. They may not have an overwhelming number of pages, but in terms of the Hegel themselves, you have to be prepared to devote a fair amount of time to getting through them. And one thing I should say with regard to the first set of readings, namely for Tuesday and Thursday, these two sections from the Science of Logic called The General Notion of Logic and With What Must the Science Begin? These are both introductory discussions, which in a certain respect are not part of the systematic argument. They reflect on what's to come, and in some respect try to prepare the way for what's to come in a very unusual manner. But they will make reference to things that await us. So there will be terms introduced that have not yet been explained anywhere. There'll even be references to another work of Hegel's, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which obviously we're not reading. But I am asking you on Thursday to read an essay from William Maker's book, Philosophy Without Foundation, which will address, in a sense, the relationship Hegel hints at between the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic, which will be something we do want to discuss even if we're not looking at the text itself. Okay. So, again, make sure that you get a good start on the readings. And let me also say that I'm available for office hours Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, 2:30 to 3:15. I can also see you at other times. Just call me at my office number 542-2811, or send me an email if you want. I'd encourage you to come and see me, speak about the material, especially as we get more heavily involved in it. As you'll see, the material is especially challenging. And what I want to do today is to try to give you some inkling of what is unique about the philosophical project that Hegel pioneers, and whose, in a sense, first significant blow, positive blow, is presented in his Science of Logic. Now, I think you're all aware that philosophy as a discipline has never been either self-consciously satisfied or able to be completely satisfied with following in the manner of other disciplines, which, broadly speaking, always address a given subject matter. And in doing so, take for granted two things. On the one hand, the boundaries of their topic, of their subject matter, and on the other hand, their access to it. In a sense, these assumptions seem to be inevitable, right? If a particular science doesn't already have a predefined topic to address, it can't be the particular science it purports to be. it has nothing determinate to examine and investigate. So in a sense, its inquiry from the outset always begins confronting some predetermined, predefined area of study, whose broad definition is taken for granted at the outset. And equally, what seems just as much inescapable is that the discipline in question has to presume that it has access to that subject matter. After all, if it doesn't have access to that subject matter, if it doesn't have already at hand a method for investigating it, it can hardly do anything. So in two respects, disciplines, which we, have commonly immersed ourselves in, address their subject matter by, in a sense, making two fundamental assumptions. An assumption regarding the content of their investigation. Namely, they take for granted the broad definiteness, specificity, character of what they're addressing. So that they're addressing physics as opposed to mathematics, as opposed to French literature, as opposed to Hindi, as opposed to modern art. And by the same token, they're taking for granted, in a sense, some approach, some method, some way of knowing what they're addressing. Now, as a consequence, because they begin with these two interrelated assumptions, everything they arrive at is relative to those assumptions which are the basis of their investigations. That is, whatever they arrive at is in some respect predicated upon, based upon, and in some respect conditioned by how their subject matter is determined from the outset, how it's given. Just as whatever they arrive at is equally conditioned or relative to the method or approach that they employ from the outset. Now, as a result, it would be folly to think that by operating in this manner, one could arrive at any absolute claims about what is whatever they're addressing. Not only can the determinacy or the character arrived at regarding, or the characterization of the topic claim to have any absolute character, by the same token, the knowledge of it can hardly claim to have any absolute character. It's conditioned in both respects. In a certain respect, we remain within the domain of opinion. Opinion that's relative to various assumptions. And philosophers are not satisfied with labors of opinion in the way in which, our compatriots at universities and other departments seem to be. And this puts us in this peculiar situation that precisely because we're not satisfied with playing around with opinions that are based upon analyses of given assumptions, we can't take for granted what it is we're addressing. We can't take for granted the content of philosophical investigation, nor can we take for granted philosophy's access to its subject matter, whatever that may be. In other words, we can't take for granted what method or form our discourse should be operating with. These themselves are matters for philosophy to investigate, instead of being settled before philosophy gets underway. These are matters that philosophy has to establish for itself. So this gives philosophy, in a sense, a kind of autonomy, or the burden of a certain kind of autonomy that no other discipline can match. On the one hand, we find ourselves compelled to exercise a kind of negative freedom, where we must liberate ourselves from bondage to any prevailing assumptions. That we can't simply accept them as given. We might come to accept them later, but not simply in virtue of their being given. So on the one hand, we call everything into question. We find ourselves having to call everything into question if we're not going to be slaves to thinking. But besides exercising that negative freedom of liberating ourselves from external authority, from external givens, we also seem to be bound to exercise a positive freedom, namely of having to, through our very own exercise of philosophical activity, establish whatever it is that we're going to establish. That is, whatever we come up with regarding the nature of our subject matter, as well as whatever method or procedure we might follow, has to be established through our own resources. Within philosophy, we have to determine that ourselves, or I should say philosophical thinking, has to establish in and through its own activity what it is thinking as well as how it is to think. Now, of course, I mentioned thinking off the cuff. Philosophy may have this dual question, character, of finding itself compelled to call into question the given, both with regard to the givenness of its content, its subject matter, and the givenness of its approach. And in that regard, having to exercise an unparalleled freedom and autonomy that no other discipline can possibly exercise without throwing off the shackles that make it a particular discipline and becoming philosophical. Well, philosophy, of course, also seems to universally make use of thinking. And, in a sense, make use of thinking to a degree unmatched by any other discipline. That is, to make use of thinking and thinking alone. A thinking that somehow is able to generate through its own activity both what it is thinking about and how it is to think about what it is thinking about. Now, this privileging of thinking is something that cannot be taken for granted, obviously, by philosophy. Philosophy will somehow or other deal with the issue of why it should rely on thinking, and what connection thinking would have to the kind of autonomy that seems to be required for any attempt to go beyond the conditioned character, the relative character of those disciplines that rely upon assumptions of one sort or another. Now, in a certain respect, Socrates, as he is portrayed by Plato, presents us with the quandary we might face ourselves in. That is, if we're not going to be taken for granted what we are to know in any unconditioned sense, or how we are to go about doing it. It seems that we have no resources at our disposal to determine what to address, what questions to raise. We may, in a sense, be aware of our own ignorance, but that lack of trust in given assumptions seems to give us nothing other to do than to simply turn to what others advance as claims, where they deliver the content, where they present us with putative claims of what is true. And then we can question what they put forward. They, in a sense, are determining, in a sense, the questions to be raised, because they're, in a sense, offering the claims that we are in a position to call into question. And so we can engage in questioning them, precisely because we don't have any givens to present, have any authoritative character. But this questioning, obviously, is very limited. Through this questioning, we can get them, as Socrates will tell us, to come to recognize that they don't know what they thought they knew. To the extent that through questioning we can show that they don't have any resources of their own to justify the claims they make. And perhaps we can show this by indicating that what they think count as reasons don't support what they're claiming, or that there are inconsistencies in what they're presenting. But what can that questioning provide us with? What alone can it provide us with? What's the most it can provide us with? Can it provide us with knowledge about the truth or falsity of any of the views we're examining? Can it? I mean, it might seem that if we wanted to address their truth or falsity, we have to know what is truly the case and be able to compare what we know with what they're putting forward. Because at best, through our questioning what they have to offer, all we can see is whether they have consistent grounds for what they're presenting. But we don't know whether any of the grounds they offer are true or false to begin with either. So it seems that this situation where we, in a way, find ourselves perhaps with the legitimate intellectual grounds for embarking on a quest for truth, namely we're aware of our own ignorance, leaves us at an impasse. Because at most we can question the claims of others, but that questioning can at most have a negative result. That is, it can lead others to be aware of their own ignorance. But it can't lead any of us to know what is true, or even what is false. At best, we can see whether certain assumptions fit together or don't fit together. Now, in a way, it's natural that the attempt to go beyond this impasse has led thinkers to try to find something that is given, yet at the same time appears to be beyond all assumption. Namely, it seems that we're trying to get beyond the hold of opinion. We want to locate that which is not simply a product of opinion, which is not itself relative to the choices and theoretical assertions of individuals. We want to get at not what is a product of convention, what is determined by anything else, but we want to somehow uncover that which is determined by nothing else, is relative to nothing else, is not conditioned by anything else, is not determined or posited by anything else, is not derivative of anything else. And in that regard could be said to not presuppose anything. And it seems what we would need to uncover is what is not by convention but by nature, or perhaps what is given immediately, in the sense of not given and mediated by something else, by being determined by something else or resting upon something else, but something that is ultimately fundamental. Something which rests on nothing, and if anything else, could be said to be that on which everything else could be said to rest. So after all, if we want to try to get at any kind of content that's not relative or conditioned, and to have any knowledge of it that isn't relative or conditioned, we need to find something that is without qualification, that is not based on anything else, is not mediated by anything else, but simply is immediately. Or if you want to contrast nature with convention, where convention is that which is determined by will, by the stipulations of rational agents, what we need to get at is not what is constructed by individuals, but what is given immediately. And we want to get at it in a way where in getting at it, we don't do anything to it. We don't modify it. We simply take it in immediately. And in a sense, how could one describe the kind of cognition that attends immediately to what is immediate? That does not address an object that is determined by the knowing that takes it in. What is the kind of knowing that is ordinarily described like that? What's often spoken of as intuition? We intuit that which is given. And given in the privileged sense of being ultimately given, immediately given, not mediated upon anything else. and we take it in immediately, and in no respect modifying it or doing anything to it by intuiting it, or another way, one might say, taking it in a contemplative way, not constructing what we know, but accessing what is given in a way that is purely passive in character, purely immediate. And in this respect, we're all familiar with philosophers who have found that it would seem the only way we get to that which lies beyond all assumption is by addressing that which is immediately given in the sense of what comes ultimately first, what is without further qualification, and which could be said to serve as the first principle for everything else that would rest upon it, or be derivative or mediated, as opposed to having that kind of privileged immediacy. Now this sort of becomes the recipe for that approach in philosophy that in a sense begins philosophy by turning to what is without further qualification, by beginning philosophy with ontology, and an ontology that addresses what comes first, that searches for what is the first principle of all that is, and which as such can only be known immediately, because you can't know it as being derived from anything else or produced from anything else. We will know it contemplatively, through an intuition of that which comes first. And from that which comes first, we can derive what is determined by what comes first. And in that respect, we come up with a totality of, well, a knowing that is absolute, which in a sense could be said to have two related characters. On the one hand, it will involve an intuition of first principles, of that which is ultimate, of that which is immediately given. And then a kind of deductive or derivative knowledge of that which follows from it. Now this approach has indeed seemed natural to legions of philosophers. But as their history shows, there is a problem with this approach, which presumes that the way we can go beyond assumptions is to address what is, to do ontology, to seek that which comes first, to intuit that which comes first. And that is that this form of being first, of being the first principle, of being what is ultimately immediate, seems to be formal in character, meaning that it doesn't of itself indicate what content the immediate, or what comes first, should have. Instead, we find a whole panoply of different candidates for first principles on the part of those who want to go beyond opinion by setting out, by reading off the character of the given, and doing ontology as the first investigation one must engage in. Right? We have the pre-Socratics who come up with various physical and then mental characterizations of what comes first. You have Plato suggesting that it's the good that is that which comes first and rests beyond all assumptions. Aristotle will present notions of an ultimate primary substance, characterized as some thinking thought or as an unmoved mover. But the question is, how can one legitimate which of the contenders is the real McCoy? And when it comes to trying to figure out what is it that is ultimately immediate, there seems to be a problem. One can't seek reasons that will determine what counts as first. One can't derive what comes first from anything else. Why not? One can't provide grounds for why it is what is ultimate. Why not? Corey, what happens if one were to attempt to do that?
It wouldn't come first.
Yeah, it would cease to come first. It would now be derivative. And what you would be supplying as the reason or ground for its primacy would be something that really is primary to it. So it seems one can't look for any antecedent grounds or any reasons in that sense to determine which candidate or what ultimately is valid. So it might seem we can operate indirectly. And it might seem that we have maybe two broad ways of operating indirectly. One would be to say, okay, we can certify that it's not water that is what is ultimate, but it's nous, it's mind, by showing that everything derives from not water, but nous. Now, to pull that off, what do we have to have at our disposal? And what do we have to have at our disposal, independently of knowing, in a sense, what comes first?
A means of inquiry.
In a sense, we need to have a means of inquiry for getting at what? That we would have to know in order to be able to say, aha, this is what is ultimately first. Well, in a sense, first of all, we have to be able to purport to know about everything and not leave anything out. Because we have to be able to certify, yes, we have shown that everything, without exclusion, rests upon, is determined by this privilege given, this privilege ground. But how can we be in a position to know that we have exhausted the range of what is? If, in a sense, to know what is, we have to know what comes first. Because everything else rests upon it and can't truly be known unless we know it as coming from what comes first and how it's determined by what comes first. So in a sense, it would seem we already have to have knowledge of both what everything is, as well as how it derives from what comes first. But how can one do that without knowing what comes first already? Or that it is what comes first. Now, a similar tactic would be to say, okay, we can do it in a different way. We can do it by trying to eliminate all other candidates for what is ultimate, by showing that they fail to either be without ground, or they fail to be that on which everything else rests. Now, by excluding other candidates, are we able to support the truth of a different candidate? What would we have to show in order to be able to do that? That is, to show the truth of one candidate for what comes first by eliminating other candidates. Well, to some degree, we have to presume that we have exhaustively eliminated all the other candidates. We have to know what all the other candidates are, and we'd also, in a sense, have to know that there is something like a principle of excluded middle. That if they're not true, then this has to be true. But with what right could we lay claim to such a principle? If everything is supposed to rely, first of all, on this ultimate, which has to be known really before we can know anything else. So it seems there's something paradoxical, maybe self-defeating about this entire quest for moving beyond the field of opinion, beyond assumptions, by finding some ultimate given, some privilege given that can be known as what fundamentally is, which could be somehow known directly, intuitively. Now, in a certain respect, one can step back and say, on the one hand, if no given content can lay claim to the privilege of being ultimate on the basis of its content, on the basis of what it is, then it seems that its being where it is placed depends upon something else that determines it to come first. And it might seem, well, in that respect, maybe we have to look at not what is, but rather how what is determined. But in another respect, one could see that in all of these efforts to read off the character of the given, to begin by doing ontology, but begin by answering what is, one is taken for granted that one's knowing or cognition is up to the task of revealing what is. Aren't we taking that for granted? Every time we simply make a claim about what is, or make a claim about other things that derive from what is fundamental. Now, recognition of that assumption, and a recognition that, in a sense, is tied to that no given in virtue of its content can claim to be ultimate. All of this leads to a different strategy. A strategy that looks back at the attempt to do philosophy by beginning with ontology, by beginning with answering the question what is, by looking for what is ultimately given and immediate. This becomes regarded as something dogmatic, as something that's not really critical of its own engagements. And so there is a demand for a critical philosophy, a philosophy that will not begin by making claims about what is, about the given. It will not begin by making ontology first philosophy, but will instead turn to investigate knowing, to certify that knowing is sufficient to get at what is. So instead of beginning with ontology and beginning with an appeal to what is immediate, one is instead going to take a turn and address knowing and critique knowing. Now, of course, Kant is the great pioneer for this engagement of what comes to be called transcendental philosophy. And this effort attempts to get away from appealing to the given and reading off the character of the given and answering the question what is immediately, by instead turning to knowing without making any claims about the object of knowing. Now, this might appear to be a vain enterprise, because how can one turn to criticize knowing and evaluate the truth of knowing if one is not in a position to know anything about the object of knowing prior to an investigation of knowing? Because ordinarily you'd think that if we're going to be in a position to criticize whether knowing is legitimate, we have to be able to compare its claims about its objects with the objects themselves. We have to have access to the objects. We have to have immediate knowledge of the objects. We have to, in a sense, have precisely what has been cast into doubt. Maybe the kind of knowledge that ontology presumes to dispose of. Well, in a way, the only manner in which an investigation of knowing could possibly shed light on the validity of knowing is if somehow or other knowing determines the object of knowing. Because only if knowing determines the object of knowing, only if knowing puts into the object what can be known about it, can we determine whether knowing has any objectivity, whether knowing gives us any knowledge of objects by focusing on knowing itself, without purporting to have a direct access to what is apart from knowing. That is, if the structure of knowing determines the character of its object, then and only then can a critique of knowing or a turn to investigate knowing shed light on whether knowing has any objectivity. But that means now we have this great shift. First of all, what comes first is epistemology, that is, an investigation of knowing. a knowing of knowing. Not a knowing of what is, but a knowing of knowing. And the knowing of knowing is one which is going to turn to investigate how cognition or knowing determines the character of its object. Now that means that what is the object of knowing has a very definite logical structure. It's not going to be immediate. It's going to be mediated. And what is it going to be mediated by? Or another way of putting it, it's not going to be unconditioned. It's going to be conditioned. In the sense it has conditions, and where do those conditions reside? They reside in knowing. They reside, in a sense, in the conditions of knowing, by which knowing is held to determine the character of the object that it knows. So the object is in some respect constructed by knowing, where knowing takes an active role in determining what it knows. It's no longer contemplative. It's no longer merely intuiting. It's engaged in constructing what it knows. But that means that what is knowable has the form of being something conditioned, something that has a ground. And that ground is the structure of knowing, however that be construed. That determines the character of its object. Now, if you take the example of Kant, that puts peculiar limitations on the field of what is objectively knowable. Because if what is objectively knowable must be conditioned, not unconditioned, must be determined from something outside itself, not from something within itself. What sorts of things, in principle, cannot be known? Well, whatever is unconditioned. Whatever is not determined externally, but internally. Whatever is self-determined. Such as the free individual. Such as the conditions of knowing. Because the conditions of knowing determine something else. They're not determined by conditions. They are the conditions that determine the conditioned objectivity that knows them. Which means that knowing, however it be characterized, which is held to determine what can be known, for that very reason becomes kind of off limits as a topic of knowledge. Because what is knowable is only what is determined by the conditions of knowing. What thereby is conditioned. But the conditions themselves are not objects. They are the conditions of objects, the grounds of objects. And then the question is, well, what about the claims made about these conditions of knowing? To begin with, the whole turn to investigate knowing was based upon recognition that we couldn't simply begin by reading off what is. There's something irretrievably dogmatic and uncritical about doing that. But in turning to investigate knowing, instead of beginning with ontology, in making epistemology foundational instead of making ontology foundational, by making epistemology first philosophy, aren't we immediately turning to knowing and reading off what knowing is? However we characterize, is characterized in some way. Kant will characterize knowing, the conditions which determine the object of knowing, in terms of the structure of consciousness, or more particularly self-consciousness. Others will characterize it in different ways. Heidegger will characterize that structure which determines the object of knowing as in a sense, the embeddedness in the world of the engaged practical subjects. Others will turn to language as being that structure which determines what can be spoken of and how it can be spoken of. Others will speak about, in a sense, the whole structure of interpretation, with all of its historical givenness as being that which determines what can be known by any knower. But in each case, claims are being made about these conditions of knowing. They're being described and characterized in a certain way. And not only are they being characterized, in other words, there is knowledge of what conversation is, of what language is, of what interpretation is, of what consciousness is. But furthermore, these various factors are then privileged and treated as determining foundations, which determine how objects are structured in order to be knowable. So in a sense, the turn to investigate knowing is just as uncritical about its knowing of knowing as dogmatic philosophy was uncritical about its knowing of what is. The critical philosophy immediately addresses knowing and reads off its character. Those of you who are familiar with the various representatives know that's what they do. Conscious stipulates the character of the various structures of knowing, it be its sensibility or the understanding, etc., etc. And there it is. And obviously there's a difference between the cognition under investigation, which is the cognition of conditioned objects, and the knowing of the transcendental investigator, who is engaging in a knowing of knowing. That knowing of knowing is not investigated. The knowing it knows is what's being investigated. And the knowing it knows is not knowing of knowing. It's a knowing of objects. Objects that are conditioned. Now, in a sense, that problem has led various transcendental philosophers to try to escape what they see as a problem we find in Kant, where Kant recognizes that the conditions of knowing, the structure of knowing that determines what can be known, is not itself an object of knowledge. It's something to be characterized as being noumenal in character. It doesn't appear to knowing. But Kant is not very reflective about whether that's a problem or not. But others who want to turn to knowing in a certain respect want to escape that problem by treating the determining structures of knowing, the structures that determine what we can know, by making them object-like, so that it might appear they could be known just like the objects they condition. So instead of treating the determining conditions of knowing as a noumenal subjectivity, that is a pure consciousness that never appears in experience, one puts that determining structure of knowing in the world and turns to language, an actual practice involving plurality of individuals, or turns to the being in the world of the subject, the concrete subject, immersed in care and practical relationships to the world in which it's involved. Now, once you make this move of trying to eliminate the distinction between the knowing that determines what can be known and the object of knowing, by making them both equally worldly or object-like, there is a problem that, for example, Husserl addresses under the charge of psychologism. You can't get away by treating the conditions that determine how objects of knowledge are determined as just another object. Because if it's just another object, determined as an object, how can it have that Archimedean role of determining objectivity as a whole? It can't just be one object among others, if it's really going to be that determining condition, which renders objects what they knowably can be. So whether the transcendental philosopher, making epistemology first philosophy, characterizes knowing as something outside of objectivity, or characterizes it as something in the world, as something worldly, there's still this problem. The way it is being just as immediately referred to, just as immediately taken in as the being that pre-critical ontology attempts to address. So where are we now? It seems that on the one hand, we haven't overcome the hold of opinion, of assumptions, if on the one hand we turn to what is, make ontology what comes first, and read off the character of the given, and seek out the first principle. We haven't overcome assumptions by instead turning to knowing and reading off the character of knowing and treating it as the determiner of knowable objectivity. In both cases, we're making fundamental assumptions. We're presuming a foundation. A foundation in being, in the case of first principles, a foundation in knowing. We're either taking some given as being privileged or taking a determiner as privileged. A determiner that determines objectivity, namely the structure of knowing, or ultimately a first principle of being that is ultimately ultimate. Now, it appears that in both respects we have philosophy succumbing to foundationalism. Namely, where philosophy begins with some ultimate foundation. It could be characterized ontologically, it could be characterized epistemologically. It could be characterized as a form of being, it could be characterized as a form of knowing. But it's taken as being ultimate, as ultimately determinative, and as being simply stipulated, precisely because it just comes immediately first. Now, where are we? Well, in a certain respect, this has fueled the sails of a position that has invaded many disciplines. A position that, in a sense, is given a kind of classic statement by Nietzsche, and then is taken up by what goes by the name of postmodernism. And that's the notion that indeed all discourse, all knowing, all attempt to set up anything normative in either theory or practice is always beholden to foundations. Is always based upon or predicated upon givens of one sort or another. And these givens are themselves contingent. In a sense, they're contingent upon being privileged by whoever privileges them. Be it privileged by someone individually or privileged by a group, communally. And once one recognizes that, then one recognizes that those activities of seeking truth, of seeking what is right, of attending to what is normative and distinguishing between opinion and genuine knowledge, and custom and what is just, that all these efforts really are nothing other than an exercise of will to power, in this sense. Here we have individuals or groups putting forward something as a norm, as being universally valid. But they're putting forward something that is simply chosen by themselves, by an act of will, because it's not grounded in anything else. It's ultimately arbitrary. It's grounded in their assertion of it. And it's particular to them. It's relative to them and who they are. So in this respect, what are they doing? They're putting forward something that, in a sense, is relative to them in their particular character, but treating it as if it were universally valid. That is to say, imposing it upon all as a rule to which all others ought to submit. And that's really the character of what goes by the name of rationality. Because rationality is always making appeal to givens that, in a sense, are arbitrary, to foundations. And that's our predicament. What we need to do is just recognize that that is what's going on. It's will to power, and we just can unmask that. And maybe, if we want, impose our norms without any excuses and shove them down the throats of others, without even attempting to pretend that they have any validity. And in that respect, do what could be said to gain political expression and fashion. Some very particular agency voice itself on all others. And what's problematic about this gambit? What is it doing that it has no right to do? What does this diagnosis do? That, in a sense, goes against its very own claims. Indeed, it may be very much the case that these two approaches of dogmatic pre-critical philosophy that makes ontology first, or ultimately transcendental philosophy that makes epistemology foundational, are both foundation with it. But what does the postmodern diagnosis of will to power take for granted? Well, it takes for granted there's no alternative. It takes for granted that reason, rationality is foundation ridden. It's always bound to privileged terms, privileged vocabularies, from which it can never free itself. The justification always involves appealing to some ultimate ground, which as such can't rest upon anything else, but must be stipulated arbitrarily. That's it. That's what justification is all about. Well, how can Nietzsche or the postmoderns know this with any assurance? Because what about their own diagnosis? Shouldn't it be just another exercise of will to power? Just as much based upon arbitrary assumptions as any other? And so, can it possibly have any legitimacy? Now, is there any alternative to these three alternate strategies? And in a certain respect, there is a kind of alternative. And in a sense, one can express it negatively by saying, look, we are in a position as individuals seeking to go beyond opinion and arbitrary assumptions. We can't begin our adventure by making claims about what is. We can't begin with any preconception or determination of what we are investigating. Nor do we have any right to begin our investigation with any privileged method or privileged cognition. We can't begin by making any determinate claims about knowing or any determinate claims about what is or objects of knowing. Another way of putting it, we can't make appeal to privileged givens. We can't make appeal to privileged determiners. Or, to put it another way, we can't rely upon any foundations whatsoever. Now, what does it mean in a positive sense to engage in a foundation-free philosophizing? A philosophizing that neither does ontology in the sense of appealing to what is given and reading off the given, or a philosophizing that makes epistemology, the knowing of knowing, foundational, and make that what comes first. What are we left with? What are we doing? Now, in a certain respect, you get a quick look at what this might mean if you think about the problem of appealing to a foundation. And in the following manner. Right? If we regard what is valid, and validity could apply to truth, it could apply to what's right, in the field of conduct. If we take what is valid to be valid in virtue of owing its validity to something else, where its validity rests on a foundation, on something different from it. With that the case, there's a question that obviously arises. What gives the alleged foundation its privileged position to convey legitimacy on something else? What gives it its legitimacy to play that role? Now, if it's really the foundation, it cannot rely upon anything else. But if it owes its legitimacy to nothing else, if it is the source of all legitimation, then if it's going to be consistent, where is its legitimacy going to come from? If it is the condition or the foundation of all normativity, of all truth, of all right, where is its own truth or its own right to play that role going to reside or rest upon?
Itself.
Well, itself, right? To be consistent, it somehow has to be self-grounding. But in a sense, that means that now we have something that sort of eliminates the distinction that foundationalism rests upon. Namely, a difference between what conveys or gives or affords validity and what possesses validity. Because now it's one and the same thing. So here, instead of having something founded upon something else, we have something that is determined by itself. Instead of having something merely given, or ultimately something that determines something else, or is determined by something different from itself, we have something that is self-determined. It seems that when foundationalism is required to become self-referentially consistent, or to in a sense, pay its dues, and deal with the validity of its own foundation, it has to eliminate the divide that is the basis of foundationalism. That is this idea that justification can be thought of in terms of a distinction between what justifies and what is justified. Yes?
Well, when asked how can that be, are you just doomed to silence because it's self-referential in itself? Can you even talk about it? Because if you ask, like, how can that be, you're kind of doomed to foundationalism again.
Well, we'll have to see whether you are doomed to foundationalism when you ask, how could it be? How could something be self-determined? This is one simple way of putting it. How can something really be autonomous? How can something not have a validity that resides on anything else? And, this has obviously some resonance when you think about the aspirations of philosophy as continually a claim to, namely of being, in some respect, the freest of all sciences, as Aristotle put it. Precisely because it cannot accept submitting to the authority of any other source or discipline or dogma. But then the question is, how can it be autonomous? How can it be determined? How can it operate without resting on foundations, which as such could be said to be things that are accepted without examination? Yes?
Just related to that slightly, since there's two basic options, reading off of the given and then appealing to determination, why would you not interpret the foundation as self-given rather than self-determining? Why would you choose one versus the other? Or do they have fundamentally different meanings?
Yeah, well, that is something I think we want to explore. In what sense is something being merely given different from something being self-determined? Now, let me just present a possible clue that we will want to explore, and obviously it's going to be very much something that we're going to find under examination. If we think about something being self-determined, we're talking about something that has this peculiar character, namely it is what it determines itself to be, which indicates that in a sense there is a process of determining where, peculiarly enough, what is determining itself cannot be at the outset, at the start, as something immediate. Somehow what it is mediated by itself, by a determining process that resides within itself, which indicates that, in a sense, as opposed to a given, it simply is immediately. We're here dealing with something that, as self-determined, necessarily involves some kind of development. And a development that is going to be different from what happens when we have something else determining something else, such as when a cause has an effect upon something. We have something of a different character. And dealing with it, obviously is something that is very challenging conceptually. But on the other hand, it might well be that it lies at the core of the whole philosophical undertaking, to the extent that philosophy requires a kind of autonomy that no other kind of investigation can match. And of course, we want to think about whether thinking has something about it that might make it peculiarly autonomous or self-determining, or that conceptual determination has a character, unlike, well, if we want to speak in psychological terms, other kinds of representations. Well, Hegel is going to be inaugurating what I'm going to call a foundation-free systematic philosophy. A philosophy that's going to recognize that, well, philosophy has to be presuppositionless. And that's not really something new. I mean, all philosophers in some respect have paid heed to that demand. But he's going to recognize that this can't be done. Philosophy begins by doing ontology, by simply appealing to what is given. It can't be done by turning to investigate knowing and making immediate claims about knowing. It can't be done by beginning with any predeterminations concerning what we're investigating or how we're going to go about doing it. So the question is, what then are we going to be doing? And this might appear to be completely paradoxical. And I think you're going to find as we get into the argument is unlike any argument you're used to. Because it is not an argument that's going to appeal to reasons and foundations in the way in which argument typically has operated, at least some argument, or at least the argument that you shove down your throats as the model of reasoning, namely formal logical argument, which operates with givens, right, premises, and given operations, all of which are taken for granted, or one could say, all of which are stipulated. Now, let me say the following. Hegel publishes 4 books in his life. The first book, he's born in 1770. In 1807, he publishes his first book. It's called The Phenomenology of Spirit. Very long, difficult work, which you'll see him describing in the introductory sections of The Science of Logic as being, in a way, an introduction to presuppositionless science. That has a very paradoxical ring to it. How could something be an introduction to something that has no presuppositions? It must be an introduction in a very peculiar way. Well, this phenomenology of spirit has usually not been interpreted with an eye to its role as an introduction to presuppositionless science. It's instead been regarded as if it were itself a philosophical doctrine in its own right. But I think you'll see by the way in which Hegel briefly refers to it in these introductory sections that it has a very different role to play. It's rather paving the way for something that needs no introduction. And what it is that will need no introduction goes by the name of the Science of Logic, which he publishes in 3 installments, starting in 1812, 1817, 1818. And by the way, I mean, ever since he finally gets a university career after teaching high school for quite a while, and teaching high school students pretty much like he lectures to his college students, and it's not that much different from what you're going to be reading. It's maybe you wonder about what's going on in the classroom. Who are these students? But he's working, and he's, you know, for maybe the remainder of his life, starting from when he's in his 20s, on all parts of what will turn out to be a system of philosophy without foundations. And obviously, we have to ask ourselves, and we have to see what Hegel has to say on this topic of why he would characterize this first part of a philosophical system that is not going to be appealing to the given or to any determination of knowing at the outset as a science of logic. This here, the science of logic, in a sense, what comes first in this pioneering effort at a systematic philosophy that has no foundations. Now, this science of logic is not at all like any logic we've ever encountered under the name of logic. Yet, in a way, there's something about it that connects it to every logic you have ever looked at. And I think you begin to see it when you look at how Hegel speaks about logic, because in a sense he addresses the project of logic that logic has always been grappled with. And attempts to show that in a sense, if you think it through, you really end up with what philosophy itself has to be doing to escape foundations. And he has an alternate introductory discussion called With What Must Science Begin, which deals with the problem of how one can begin without assumptions, without taking anything for granted. And in a sense, is showing that what has to be done is precisely what happens when logic does what logic is cracked up to be. Well, logic is a thinking of thinking. And in being a thinking of thinking, there's something very unique about logic, which separates it from every other investigation that uses thinking. What's the difference? The immediate difference. That's immediately staring you in the eye the moment you recognize that logic is the thinking about thinking. All other investigations using thinking think about what? Something different from thinking. So think about what position that puts them in. They're thinking not about thinking, but about something else. That means that in their thinking about something else, they're making use of a thinking that they are not investigating. They're making use of a thinking that they are not putting under scrutiny. Because what they're putting under scrutiny is not thinking, but something else that they're thinking about. There's a difference between, you could say, the subject of the investigation and the object of the investigation. But in logic, the thinking and what is thought about are one and the same. There's no distinction that can be drawn between the subject and the object. Or maybe one might say between the form and content. And that's going to have very important ramifications when you try to think through what that means for logic. What does it mean for logic to have this peculiar character? Where it's a thinking about thinking, and there's no difference that can be drawn between what it's addressing and how it's addressing it. Well, you're going to see that Hegel is going to speak about what he will call consciousness. And he'll speak about consciousness using a term, in a sense, to address something familiar to us all, but also as something that speaks about a certain kind of knowing, which is distinguished by always confronting an object distinct from its awareness of it, where there's a difference, one might say, between subject and object. And Hegel's going to make the claim that this opposition of consciousness, this knowing that addresses something different from itself, bars the way to philosophy. And this distinction is, in a sense, characteristic of what's here called consciousness. It's something, in a sense, that must not be taken as absolute, must not be taken as definitive or known, because if it is, it's impossible for there to be philosophy. Well, we want to see how this operates, what follows. What I want you to do is to move into the opening part of the science of logic, and do it slowly, because you're hit with a lot all of a sudden. And mull it over. And as always in addressing the work of philosophy, I think you want to do two things. First of all, you want to identify what it is that is being rejected. What positions, what strategies are being shown to be deficient, and how are they being shown to be deficient? And what positive lessons does that critique offer? And what inkling do we get of the different direction that needs to be taken, given the deficiencies that are exposed? And let me say very quickly what I'm going to be asking you to do beyond the reading. And that has to do with the assignments that are on the back page of the syllabus. There will be no tests in this class, but no tests. There will just be 3 papers. For the scholarly, loquacious graduate students among you, the first 2 essays will be 7 pages or so each, and the term paper will be 20 pages. For the laconic undergraduates, the 2 essays will be 5 pages, and the term paper will be 15 pages. And in each case, I will give you a topic well ahead of time for you to write on. And obviously come and see me about it if you have any misunderstandings concerning it. But that's it basically. Otherwise, I will have an attendance requirement. Namely, I don't want you to miss 4 or more sessions. I think the material, as you'll see, is difficult and very much unlike anything you've probably experienced elsewhere. So I think it's important to come to class and grapple with the material, participate, and come see me during office hours. But, so I will penalize you if you don't attend. I'm going to take attendance by setting up a seating chart, which I'll do next Tuesday. So next Tuesday, find a seat that you're comfortable with, and I'll make up a seating chart, and I'll know whether you're there or not. Okay. So make sure you've filled out that pad where I'm asking you your name, your major, program, what philosophy class, what maybe you read, and you can pass that up. Does everyone have the syllabus? And anyone who is late, there has been a problem, I'm afraid, in getting the books into the campus bookstore. They may not arrive until next Tuesday. In the meantime, everything is on reserve, but the reserve copies of the Science of Logic may not be available until tomorrow afternoon. I gave them today, and they're calling back when it's out. So if you can obtain the book on your own somewhere quickly, do so. Otherwise, they should be in the various bookstores.